You're too comfortable being average, and I refuse to stay stuck here, she told me during a fight about money and ambition. I nodded, packed my things quietly, and left. Months later, she watched a podcast interview where I explained the business strategy that completely changed my life without ever mentioning her name. You're too comfortable being average. She said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing for weeks. Not loud, not shaking, just flat, certain, like a verdict she had already delivered in her head 100 times before she ever opened her mouth. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something inside me go very, very quiet. Not the quiet of defeat, the quiet of someone who has just understood something they can never ununderstand. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. She wasn't wrong, technically. I wasn't where I wanted to be. I knew that. But there's a difference between someone who sees your struggle and stands beside you in it, and someone who uses your struggle as evidence that you're not worth standing beside. Valencia had always known the difference. She just stopped caring about it somewhere around month 18. And the worst part? I had watched it happen. Slowly, like a tide pulling out. And I had told myself it was just stress, just a rough patch, just the pressure of two people trying to figure out their lives at the same time. I told myself that right up until the night she stood across from me in our kitchen at 11:47 p.m. and told me I was average like it was the most obvious thing in the world. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that 2 weeks before that night, I had written something down in a notebook. A plan. Just 4 pages. Messy handwriting, coffee stains on the corner, 3 different ink colors because I kept losing the same pen. 4 pages that I hadn't shown anyone yet. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wasn't ready to defend it to someone who had already decided the verdict. I didn't realize it then, but I should have known that night was coming. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 29. She was 27. We'd been together for 2 years and 3 months. We shared an apartment in a part of the city that was either up and coming or permanently almost there, depending on who you asked. I had a stable but unremarkable job in logistics coordination. She had a position at a mid-sized marketing firm that she described as fine for now. We split rent. We split groceries. We split most things, actually, including, eventually, our future. The fight didn't start about ambition. It started about a used car. Orion, my closest friend since college, had offered me a deal on his old car. He was upgrading, didn't want the hassle of selling it to a stranger, and told me I could take it off his hands for $4,200. It needed 2 new tires and a brake job. Maybe another $500-600 after that. Still a solid deal for a car that had 2 more good years in it. Easy. I brought it up at dinner on a Thursday. Valencia put her fork down. Slowly. The way people do when they want you to notice they're putting their fork down. We just talked about saving more this quarter, she said. I know, but it's under $5,000 all in. I've been using ride shares every day. Over a year. This pays for itself. That's not the point. Then what is the point? She picked her fork back up, took a bite, set it down again. The point is that every time we try to get ahead, you find something to spend money on. I sat with that for a second. I thought about the last 6 months. The gym equipment I had returned. The online course I had paid for with my own freelance money, not our joint account. The weekend trip I had quietly dropped because she mentioned the cost once and I didn't want to push it. I thought about all the times I had adjusted, recalibrated, shrunk myself down a little to keep the peace. That's not fair, I said, quietly. No heat in it. Just fact. She didn't respond. We finished dinner in silence. But the fight, the real fight, came 3 days later. And it came out of nowhere. Or what felt like nowhere. Looking back, it came out of everywhere all at once. It was a Sunday. She had been on her phone most of the morning. I was at the kitchen table, working through that 4-page notebook, adding to it, filling margins, sketching rough numbers. She walked past twice without saying anything. On the 3rd pass, she stopped. What is that? Notes. Ideas I've been working on. For what? I looked up. I tried to gauge her energy. The air in the room had that specific weight it gets before something breaks. A business concept, I said. Supply chain consulting, but niche. Small e-commerce brands that are scaling and running into fulfillment problems. I've been in logistics long enough to know exactly where they bleed money. There's a real gap in that market. She stared at the notebook, then at me. You're serious? Yeah. You're sitting here drawing up a business plan. She paused. When we don't even have a proper emergency fund. Our emergency fund is fine. It covers 4 months. 4 months isn't fine. 6 is fine. Okay, so we're 2 months short by your metric. That doesn't mean I stop thinking about the future. That is the future. She pointed at the counter where the bills sat in a neat stack. She had organized them. She always organized them. That stack is the future, not that notebook. I closed the notebook. Not in anger. I just closed it. Set it aside. Looked at her. What do you actually want from me right now? She crossed her arms, and I saw something shift in her face. Not anger exactly. More like frustration that had curdled into something harder and older. I want you to be realistic, she said. I want you to look at where we are and deal with it instead of daydreaming about some consulting business you've never run, in a market you've never tested, with capital you don't have. Every business starts exactly like that. Not every business. Successful businesses start with people who are actually driven enough to make them work. And there it was. The first shot. Fired clean. I didn't respond. She kept going. I used to think you were just being careful, taking your time. But I've been watching you for 2 years. You've had how many ideas? 3, 4? And none of them go anywhere because you don't push. You don't fight for anything. You just settle. That's not who I am. Then show me who you are. Because from where I'm standing, she stopped, exhaled, and then said it. You're too comfortable being average. And I refuse to stay stuck here. The kitchen was very quiet after that. Not the comfortable kind of quiet. The kind that rings a little, the way a glass does after it shatters. I nodded. Just once. Slow. I picked up the notebook. And I started thinking about things I hadn't let myself think about clearly in a very long time. She expected a fight. I could see it. She was braced for it, shoulders tight, jaw set, ready to go another 3 rounds. And there's a version of me, the version from a year before, who would have given her exactly that. Who would have pushed back hard, gotten louder, tried to prove something in the moment, and then apologized by morning because the relationship meant more than being right. But something had changed in those 3 days between the fork and the notebook. Something had finished calculating. I said, okay. She blinked. Okay, what? Okay. You've made yourself clear. I hear you. That's it. That's all you're going to say. I think so, yeah. She stared at me for a long time. And then, almost confused, she walked to the bedroom and closed the door. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened the notebook again, and I wrote 2 words at the top of a fresh page. Start Monday. I didn't pack that night. I wasn't dramatic about it. I gave it 72 hours. Not because I was unsure, but because I've learned the hard way that decisions made in the middle of an emotional spike can look different 3 days later. So I waited. I slept in the apartment. I made coffee in the morning. I went to work. I came home. I watched how she moved through the space, whether she softened, whether she reached back toward me, whether anything had shifted. Nothing shifted. On the 3rd day, she came home, sat on the couch with her laptop, and went through 2 hours of Netflix shows without once looking over at the chair where I was sitting. Not out of cruelty. I think genuinely without noticing. That was it. That was the confirmation I needed. I didn't announce it. I didn't stage it. I packed 2 bags. Laptop, notebooks, clothes, documents. Left the furniture. Left most of the kitchen stuff. Left the framed photo of us at Orion's birthday party that she'd insisted we print and hang up because we never print anything anymore. I left my key on the counter, and I walked out. She wasn't home when I left. I didn't time it that way deliberately, but I also didn't fight the timing. The first week was strange. I stayed at Orion's place, on a pull-out couch that had 1 broken spring right in the middle, and I woke up every morning at 6 a.m. whether I wanted to or not, because the spring found my spine like it had a personal grudge. And every morning I lay there for exactly 10 minutes staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like the state of Montana. And I asked myself the same question. Do you regret leaving? The answer was always the same. No, not because it didn't hurt. It hurt plenty. 2 years leaves marks whether the ending was right or not. But regret requires believing you made the wrong choice. And I couldn't make myself believe that. Every time I tried, I heard her voice again, flat and certain, verdict already delivered, and the clarity came back immediately. What I did regret was time. Not time with her, specifically. Time in general. The months I had spent adjusting instead of building. The ideas I had half-started and quietly shelved because the apartment's energy didn't support them. The version of me that had gotten very good at making himself smaller and calling it compromise. I was done with that version. On day 8 at Orion's, I started making calls. Old contacts from the logistics world. Former colleagues who had moved into different sectors. A guy named Wesley I had worked a short contract with 3 years before, who was now running a small third-party logistics company and constantly complaining about how the small brands he worked with had no idea what they were doing operationally. I called Wesley on a Tuesday afternoon, asked him if we could grab coffee. He said sure, mentioned he was swamped, said he could do 30 minutes Friday morning. Friday morning turned into 2.5 hours. By the end of it, he said, "I've been trying to explain this problem to people for 2 years. You just described it better in 15 minutes than I've managed in 24 months. Why aren't you doing this professionally?" I held up the notebook. He laughed. "Okay," he said, "let's talk about what this actually looks like. I'm going to be honest about the next few months because the temptation when telling a story like this is to make the rise feel clean. Like a movie montage. Like everything clicked into place perfectly once I made the brave choice. That's not how it happened. What actually happened was messier. I picked up 2 consulting clients in the first 6 weeks. Both of them small. Both of them paying me less than I was worth because I didn't have the credibility yet to charge what I should have been charging, and I knew it. And I took the work anyway because the portfolio mattered more than the rate at that stage. I was still working my regular job at the same time. Mornings before 8 and evenings after 6 were mine. I built systems, refined the pitch, documented every process improvement I made for those first 2 clients so I could show real before and after data when the next conversation came. Orion's pull-out couch became a sublease in a small 1-bedroom in a building with a broken elevator and a landlord who communicated exclusively through notes slid under doors. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, fully mine, and there was a kind of lightness in that I hadn't expected. I hadn't felt that lightness in a long time. Maybe not since before Valencia and I had moved in together. The third client came through a referral from Wesley. Bigger. A brand doing about $4 million in annual revenue that was hemorrhaging money on their fulfillment side. Wrong carrier mix. No zone skipping strategy. Return processing that was costing them nearly 8% of gross margin unnecessarily. I spent 3 weeks in their operations, built out a full audit, and delivered a restructured logistics framework that cut their operational waste by roughly 22% inside the first quarter. They referred 2 more clients. One of those referred another. By month 5, I had exited my regular job. By month 7, I had hired my first part-time contractor. By month 9, I was billing more in a single month than I had made in any 6-month stretch at the logistics coordination job. None of it felt like a triumph. Exactly. It felt like work. The right kind of work, the kind that exhausts you in a way that leaves you satisfied rather than hollow. But it was still just work. Consistent, focused, daily. I never posted about it online. I'm not a social media person. I had a LinkedIn I updated once a year. No Instagram. No Twitter presence worth mentioning. I was just building quietly, the same way I had always preferred to do things. Which is why what happened with the podcast was strange and unexpected. And, if I'm being completely honest, exactly the kind of thing I should have seen coming but didn't. It started because Wesley was friends with a guy named Thatcher who ran a small business podcast out of a studio in the Flatiron District. The show focused on operational and financial strategy for founders, not the big Silicon Valley VC-funded narrative, but the real stuff. Cash flow management, supply chain decisions, hiring your first contractor, the unsexy mechanics of actually running something. Thatcher had heard about my work through Wesley. He reached out in month 8 and asked if I'd come on the show. I said no the first time, not from false modesty. I just didn't feel like the story was ready yet. I didn't have a full year behind me. I wanted more data points before I talked publicly about a methodology. He reached out again 2 months later. This time I said yes. The episode recorded on a Wednesday afternoon. Thatcher was one of those interviewers who does very little but creates a lot of space, which sounds passive but is actually a rare skill. He asked about the gap I'd identified in the market. He asked about the early client acquisition strategy. He asked what I had seen again and again in small e-commerce operations that was costing founders real money. And then he asked the question that ended up being the one people talked about. He said, "What made you finally commit? Like, what was the actual thing that pushed you from planning to doing?" I thought about it for a second. The real answer was complex. It was a broken pull-out couch spring and a water stain that looked like Montana. It was Wesley's 2.5-hour coffee conversation. It was 4 pages of messy handwriting and 3 ink colors. It was a very quiet kitchen at 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday night. But I didn't tell him any of that. What I said was, I had a moment where I realized I had been optimizing for comfort instead of growth. And I think a lot of people do that, not because they're lazy, but because comfort is what you default to when you're around people or environments that reinforce staying still. Once I changed the environment, everything changed. The clarity came first. Then the work followed. Thatcher nodded. Changed the environment. What did that look like practically? Moved. Let go of some things I was holding on to longer than I should have. Reset the defaults. He didn't push further. We moved on. I talked about pricing strategy, client audits, the specific operational metrics I look at first when I take on a new engagement. The episode ran 47 minutes. Thatcher called it one of his better ones. I took his word for it. The episode went up on a Thursday morning. I didn't think much about it after that. 2 weeks later, Orion called me. He never calls. He texts. If Orion is calling, either something is very wrong or very interesting. I answered on the second ring. Your podcast episode, he said. What about it? Valencia listened to it. I was quiet for a moment. How do you know that? Because Emmeline told me. Emmeline was one of Valencia's closest friends. Orion and Emmeline had overlapped in enough social circles over the years that they still talked occasionally. Apparently, she sent it to Emmeline. Said she found it randomly. Said she didn't know you had done it. Okay, I said. She recognized your voice, obviously. Didn't take long. What did she say? About it. Orion paused. And Orion never pauses before he says something unless what he's about to say actually matters. She said, and I'm quoting Emmeline quoting her, I didn't realize he was actually serious about it. I thought the notebook was just another idea that was going to fizzle out. I sat with that for a long time. Long enough that Orion said, You still there? Yeah, I'm here. You okay? Yeah, I said. Actually, yeah, I'm good. And I was. But not in the way he was probably checking for. Not the fragile kind of good that you perform when you want someone to stop worrying about you. The actual kind. The kind that comes from hearing something that, 2 years ago, would have gutted you, and feeling it land and roll off. Not because you stopped caring about the person, but because you stopped needing them to be the one who believed in you first. I heard through Orion, through the Emmeline relay, which had apparently become its own functioning communication channel, that Valencia had talked about the podcast for a week after hearing it. Not obsessively, but more than once. That she had told Emmeline she didn't understand how things had moved so fast, how I had gone from the notebook to an actual operating business in under a year. Emmeline, apparently, had said something like, You called him average. Valencia, apparently, had said, I know, and then hadn't said much else about it. That was the version of the story that got back to me. Maybe it was accurate. Maybe it was translated through two people's perspectives and only resembled what actually happened. I had no way of knowing. I also found I didn't need to know. There's a certain kind of closure that comes not from a conversation, but from an absence. From realizing that you no longer require the person who doubted you to come back and revise their opinion. The validation that matters, the only kind that really feeds anything sustainable, is the kind you build yourself, through the work, through the choices, through the daily confirmation that you were right to bet on your own instincts. I had that now, not in spite of the notebook and the messy handwriting. Because of it. Here's what I never said in that podcast interview. I never said her name. Never referenced her at all. Not because I was protecting her, though I don't think she deserved to be exposed, but because she genuinely wasn't the story. She was a catalyst. Catalysts don't get credit for what they ignite. They just change the conditions. She changed the conditions. The story was the 4 pages. The story was Wesley's 2.5-hour coffee. The story was 6 a.m. and the broken spring in Montana on a ceiling. The story was the first client who paid me less than I was worth, and the third client who made me realize I was worth far more than I'd been asking for. The story was what I built when I stopped trying to build it in an environment that didn't believe it was possible. That's the part nobody talks about enough. Not the big dramatic exit. Not the bold announcement. Not the moment someone says something cruel that lights a fire underneath you. Those things happen and they matter for about 15 minutes. What matters after that is the choice. The very unglamorous, very daily, very quiet choice to sit down with the notebook again anyway. And the one after that. And the one after that. I still work out of the same one bedroom. The elevator got fixed in month 4, then broke again in month 6, and is currently in what the building management describes as active review. I've been offered the chance to move into something bigger, nicer, more in line with what the revenue figures would justify. I'm thinking about it. Maybe next year. Wesley and I have a standing Wednesday lunch now. He refers clients. I occasionally help him untangle problems in his own operation that he's too close to see clearly. It's a good arrangement. The kind that grows slowly and holds. Orion eventually stopped relaying messages through Emmeline, partly because there weren't messages to relay anymore, partly because I think Emmeline found the whole arrangement a little exhausting, which is fair. I haven't spoken to Valencia. She hasn't reached out. I haven't reached out. There's nothing to reach toward. No unfinished business. No questions left open. Whatever she took away from hearing that podcast interview, whatever she worked through or didn't work through, that belongs to her. I hope it was useful. I genuinely do. Not out of bitterness. I've got nothing bitter left about her, which I think surprised me when I first noticed it. I thought it would take longer. But here's the thing about building something real. It doesn't leave a lot of room for old resentments. Not because you've healed in some cinematic, resolved way. Just because the thing you're building keeps requiring more of you. There's always the next client, the next audit, the next problem to solve, the next thing to learn, the next version of the business that you can't quite see clearly yet, but can feel taking shape. It crowds out the stuff that used to live in the empty space. A few weeks ago, Thatcher messaged me and said the episode was consistently one of his most played. He asked if I'd come back on, maybe do a follow-up now that another year had passed. I said I'd think about it. I probably will. If I do, someone asked me in advance what I'd say differently the second time. What I'd add that I didn't say in the first episode. I thought about it. And here's what I'd add. The people who doubt you aren't always wrong about what they observe. Sometimes they see something real. Sometimes you are staying still. Sometimes you are coasting. Sometimes you have been defaulting to comfort for so long that someone looking at your life from the outside genuinely can't tell the difference between a person who's playing the long game and a person who's given up. The question isn't whether the observation is accurate. The question is whether the person making it is someone who sees the whole picture, who knows the notebook exists, who understands the 4 pages and the 3 ink colors and the plan that isn't ready to defend yet, or someone who's only looking at the surface and deciding that's the whole story. Valencia saw the surface and decided it was everything. She wasn't wrong about what she saw. She just had no idea what she wasn't seeing. That distinction matters. It matters a lot. Because the people who walk away from you based on the surface version of your story, they were never really with you in the first place. They were with the version of you that made them comfortable. The version that fit neatly into their timeline and their plans and their definition of what progress is supposed to look like. The minute your actual self started showing up, messy, uncertain, scribbling in notebooks, thinking about a market gap that most people in your world didn't even know existed, that's when they found the door. Let them find it. Pack quietly. And start on Monday. She said I was too comfortable being average. She wasn't entirely wrong. But she said it like it was my permanent address. She didn't know I was already looking for a way out. She just thought she was the one pointing it to me. She wasn't. She was just the last thing standing between me and the door.